For 100 years, Hiram Blake Camp has welcomed guests from all over the United States and parts beyond. Located on the Blake homestead, a pioneer farm, home for 9 generations of the Blake family, these shores were settled for the convenience of those who followed the sea. Long before the Blakes' arrival, the Wabanaki summered on these shores to escape the heat and mosquitoes of the northern forests and to harvest seafood so plentiful in the bay. The Blake family settled the lands in the 1700s and flourished here as sea captains, boat builders, farmers, and quarrymen. A portion of the current farmhouse was built in 1820 by Captain Henry Blake, Hiram's grandfather, and when the time came, the property passed to Hiram's parents, Charles and Henrietta. Hiram was the 5th of their 6 children. As early as 1910, after her children were grown and gone, Henrietta began to take in boarders during the summer in the farmhouse and 2 small camps located at the site of the current Maples and Edgewater. She called it Pleasant Cove House. Charles died in 1913, and Henrietta did not want to leave her home, but found it difficult managing on her own. So in 1915, Hiram and Iantha, his wife, along with their daughter Lucy, 5 years old at the time, moved back to Cape Rosier to the old homestead where Hiram had lived his early life. Due to complications during her birth, Lucy would be Hiram and Iantha's only child. Hiram and Iantha Blake were pioneers of the summer camp development in Maine. They established their camp in 1916, when overnight camps were rare and limited largely to the sporting camps of Maine's hunting and fishing country to the north and west. Both Hiram and Iantha had considerable experience in the tourist trade, having worked at a popular weekend and eating destination in Stockton Springs. Iantha in the kitchen, cooking for large numbers, and Hiram on the bay, piloting excursion crafts filled with summer folks out on the Penobscot Bay. The summer camp idea seemed to be a way to use their talents and make a living on the old place. Warm, caring, and generous by nature, Hiram and Iantha would prove to be excellent hosts, much beloved by their guests. Upon their return, they began improvements to the farm and land with a view toward summer visitors. In the fall of 1915, Hiram built the Birches, a large cottage with 5 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. The first floor was provided with 2 bedrooms and a large living room with partitions that could be removed, so that during the winter months, the space could be used for boat building. By trade a first-class boat builder, Hiram would build in succeeding years many rowboats and more than a dozen motorboats in the Birches and later the Oaks. 2 Unitarian ministers who summered nearby and had been early guests and friends of Henrietta's began recommending parishioners to the camp, who told their friends in turn. These good folks became the foundation of the camp guest community, returning to camp year after year. That first summer of 1916 saw 10 guests in the Birches, in the 3 small rooms in the farmhouse, and the small camp that would eventually become the Edgewater. The Birches had a long, wide porch with a splendid view of the bay. It was the scene of many a bridge game and tea party, popular pastimes of the day. Henrietta, fond of people and even more fond of storytelling, was an attractive camp personality and spent her time entertaining campers. With the camp's early years beginning in the midst of World War I, it was not until after the war that the camp began to grow. During successive years, when a new family contracted with Hiram and Iantha to spend a summer on Cape Rosier, a new cottage was built. In that way, Hiram Blake Camp began to flourish. Then called Peace Haven, it eventually became known informally as Hiram Blake's Camp. After Hiram's death, to honor his name, it became officially Hiram Blake Camp. In February of 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and actively entered into World War I. These were hard years for all, of course, but camp registered 19 guests during the season. Vacationers arrived by steamboat in those days, as travel was made difficult by dirt roads turned to mud in wet weather and rendered nearly impassable. The steamboat arrived at Bucks Harbor with passengers, and Hiram would ferry them to camp by boat. During the war, not much could be done in the way of building and repairs, but Hiram did build the 26-foot Juanita for camp use, and 1918 saw 13 guests. World War I ended November 11, 1918, and with the end of the war came a resurgent interest in vacationing on the coast of Maine. 1919 was notable for the water piped in from the mountain spring into the farmhouse, which made housekeeping and guest-keeping much easier for Hiram and Iantha. That year also, the brook, which had been used for generations to haul small boats up for storm protection, was dammed for use as an ice-cutting pond, and an ice house was built as well. Ice, cut in blocks and packed in sawdust, was essential for keeping meat and fish fresh. These were welcome improvements for Iantha in particular, who ran the kitchen and spent her summers keeping guests well fed. She served 3 meals a day, which left her very little time for anything else. Meals were cooked on a wood stove in the small farmhouse kitchen. One can imagine how uncomfortable that little room became on the hottest summer days. Guests would present Iantha with their catch of the day, or a pail of blueberries picked up on Blueberry Hill. She would oblige them with fish for dinner and blueberry pie for dessert. Once a week, on Sundays, Hiram would use some of the ice from the ice house and milk from the camp cow to make ice cream, a rare treat. The Blakes kept cows and chickens and tended several gardens to augment meals served to campers. Often, campers would help by gathering on the front lawn under the shade of the apple tree to chat and snap beans or shell peas for that evening's dinner. The 1920s were building years for Hiram and Iantha, and the camp continued to grow. In 1920, additional guests meant an addition to the kitchen. Hiram also built the Iantha for use as a camp boat and used the Juanita for fishing parties. In 1921, the Maples was built with 2 bedrooms, a living room with a fireplace, and a porch. This was the first of several family cottages to follow. 46 campers were registered that year, and the season stretched from June to early October. Many stayed a month. Some stayed all summer. In 1922, a second family cottage, the Spruces, with 3 bedrooms, a living room, fireplace, and porch was built. These cottages became associated with the families who stayed in them year after year. Among the ranks of camp guests, listed in the memoirs of Lucy Blake Venno, were fishermen, photographers, artists, radio enthusiasts, medical missionaries, writers, and musicians. One favorite was a camper who taught piano and was Lucy's piano instructor from 1920 to 1930. Hiram and Iantha were accomplished musicians as well. Hiram on the fiddle and Iantha on the piano. Their talents were called upon many evenings for camp sings and country dances held in the farmhouse dining room. When far enough along in her studies, Lucy would also participate. In 1923, also notable in Lucy's memoirs, was the arrival of Maurice Venno, a boy from Stockton Springs who was living on Cape Rosier while his father worked in the woods there. As a teen, He worked for Hiram and Iantha as a cabin boy, delivering hot water to cabins in the morning. He also tended the chickens and cows, mowed lawns, and weeded in the gardens. Lucy was also a part of the staff during those years, and a romance between the two would flourish. Hiram was very protective of his daughter and only child, and the relationship was clandestine. But love would triumph, and Maurice would become part of the next generation of Hiram Blake Camp proprietors. In 1924, the old fish house, well over a century old at the time, became the next cottage. Benjamin Wells, an artist who began vacationing at Blake's that summer, convinced Hiram and Iantha to convert the old building into a summer cottage. Everyone worked to clear out the years of accumulated fishing gear, though some of the tools from an earlier time were left to hang on the walls. When, at the housewarming party, Ben and wife Susan arrived in seagull costumes, it was immediately christened the Seagull's Roost. In 1925, Hiram built the Caw-Caw Lodge, currently called Crow's Nest. The story goes that a summer colony existed on Hog Island in Muscongas Bay, which closed after a time. Some of the guests who regularly summered there changed their allegiance to Hiram Blake's. Two sisters, Nellie and Ida Slade, were among these and requested that Hiram recreate their favorite cottage, and he did just that. Most of the furniture and the photos in that cottage today all came with the sisters. Also that year, Hiram remodeled the Edgewater, adding a living room with a fireplace and porch. 1926 was a big building year for Hiram and Iantha, with a laundry, bathroom, and dining room added to the farmhouse. The beginnings of Pine Lodge, now the living room, was also built that year. Cottages often had small beginnings, with just a bedroom being built, only to be added later when the need arose. The largest project was the Oaks Lodge, a cottage very similar to the Birch's cottage. The Oaks Lodge became the newest site for friendly social festivities. Notable among these were sings, games, and stunt parties. Like Birch's, the Oaks was created with space on the first floor for boat building. That winter, Hiram built the newest camp boat, the Lucy B. This was the largest camp boat thus far and was launched in 1927. In 1928, the Blakes built the Tamaracks Cottage and added 2 bedrooms to the Pine Lodge. In 1929, the shed garages with room for 6 automobiles were added to the barn. In 1929 came the crash of the stock market. Many guests who came annually lost everything, including summers on the Penobscot Bay, and the flurry of building activity during the 20s came to an end. In those lean years, a certain Dr. Winthrop Packard, a longtime camp guest who began summering at camp as early as 1919, began to bring the Massachusetts Audubon Society to Hiram Blake's camp. Cape Rosier was in the direct migration path of many songbirds, and a perfect place for birders and naturalists to spend time following their passions. This large group, who came and stayed for several weeks each summer, was credited for helping Hiram and Iantha to weather those Depression years. Also notable in 1931 was the marriage of Lucy Blake to Maurice Venno. With the backing of Hiram and Iantha, they would depart by steamship from Bucks Harbor Landing and travel to New York City, Lucy to attend the National Bible Institute, and Maurice the Union Seminary on 116th Street. They would stay in New York City and then Kingston, New York, for the next 12 years. During this time, their family would grow by 2, daughter Anne and son Paul, Hiram and Iantha's only grandchildren. In 1934 and 35, the Blakes added 2 one-room cottages, the Chickadee and the Goldfinch, named in honor of the annual presence of the Audubon camp, along with a small summer house in which to sit nearer the farmhouse. A lounge and fireplace were added to the farmhouse dining room for the group's evening gatherings. The Audubon group spent their days on nature walks, through the woods, hunting for mosses, or along the shore with mineralogists looking for specimens. Day-long trips to the islands seeking seabird sightings along with the woodland and meadow varieties were common. One year, it was recorded that they identified 104 bird species. In the evenings, gatherings were held around the fireplace to discuss what they had seen that day, or listen to lectures by one of the college profs. On Sunday evenings, campers would gather in the farmhouse to sing hymns, with first Hiram and Iantha, and later Maurice and Lucy on the violin and piano, to keep everyone on pitch. In 1937, Bangor hydroelectricity was brought as far as Hiram Blake Camp, largely through the efforts of Captain Hiram and Iantha Blake and a few interested neighbors at considerable cost. But it represented a big step forward for one remote area in convenience and greater comfort. In 1938, an artesian well was drilled. At a depth of 91 feet and a flow of 10 gallons per minute, it supplied the camp with abundant, fresh, pure water. With the advent of electricity, electric refrigerators came on the scene, and the need for ice no longer existed. In the time-honored tradition, the Blakes transformed the ice house into the Morning Glory, a small one-room cabin. Facing the rising sun on the bay in the morning, it was indeed glorious. As the years advanced, so did the standard of living, and the demands for more and more comforts in the camping life. In 1939, the Blakes built a greatly appreciated shower house for men and women close to the Birches. An old notebook of Captain Hiram's contains a list of boat trips taken in 1939 and noted 51 trips taken between July 4th and August 31st. In those days, boat trips were almost a daily occurrence. Breakfast picnics, lunch picnics, fishing trips, trips to Bucks Harbor, sunset sails, moonlight sails, seabird trips, island exploring, and often just enjoying the bay in all its splendor. In 1940, when the Blakes' new car had outgrown the garage built in the days of the Model A, Hiram moved the garage up on the ledges and made it the Fox Den, first occupied by Earl and Grace Fox, close friends of Lucy and Maurice. Also that year, with high prospects, Hiram and Iantha bought a larger boat. She was the Lilac. Built in 1937, the Lilac was 36 feet in length and had a 10-foot beam. In the spring of 1941, the Sunrise was built, located just below the Caw-Caw Lodge, and again facing the rising sun. It was another small cottage like Chickadee and Goldfinch. Also that spring, the Lilac was equipped with a new engine and had a fine run that summer, and all enjoyed and praised the new boat. When war was declared on December 11, 1941, the process of building came to a stop, while every effort was bent to the successful completion of the war. In June, just before camp opened for the summer, the Coast Guard commandeered the Lilac for the war effort. In 1943, Maurice Venno enlisted in the Navy as a chaplain. Lucy, Anne, and Paul would return to Cape Rozier to stay with the grandparents. 64 men from Brooksville would enlist in the war, and help, of course, was hard to come by. Lucy pitched in to help her parents as Hiram began to experience poor health. Iantha's brother, Alvin, beyond enlistment age, was invaluable during this time. It would be 2 years, December 29th, 1944 to be exact, before Maurice would return home. Hiram's health continued to fail, and as soon as the Navy would allow, Maurice and Lucy returned to Maine permanently to be closer to Hiram and Iantha. In 1947, Hiram's heart condition worsened, and he died quite suddenly that spring in the home where he was born 62 years earlier. Hiram's funeral was held in the dining room at Hiram Blake Camp, with friends, neighbors, and campers from afar to pay their respects. Hiram's grandson, Paul, remembers it was the most well-attended funeral he had ever been at. One letter written to Iantha during that time expressed the following: "Thank you so much for your good letter telling us about Captain Blake's last illness. In some way, you and he seemed to belong to us, and we to you. Of course, I know that is the way with everyone who went there year after year, as we have felt too. We never felt we were going somewhere to board. For a short 2 weeks, we were going home."